It was a terrible time, with that baby born dead, and with Lyman and Susan gone off to live in Timbuktu, and with Mary's own birthing date fast approaching. In itself not upsetting even to me, but it meant that Father would soon be coming to North Elba, which now, more than ever before, filled me with nameless dread. Why was his coming so dreadful? He was my father. I loved him. I believed that I had done nothing wrong. Even so, I felt strangely paralyzed, and my anticipation of his coming only seemed to make it worse. We were no longer conductors on the Underground Railroad. Without Lyman to act as liaison between us and the citizens of Timbuktu, no one came to us any more for help, which disappointed me greatly and made me a failure. "Why don't you just go over there and make it clear that we're ready to run folks north in our wagon?" Salmon demanded. "Just put it to him, Owen. What's the big deal between you and Lyman, anyhow? So what if he wants to go back and live on his own land in Timbuktu? Seems only natural, don't it?" "You don't understand." "No, I don't. He doesn't want anything more to do with us Browns." "Why? Because of Susan's baby?" "I don't know, Salmon. You talk to him if you want. You go over there and you tell him how much he needs us to help him help his Negro brethren, Salmon. You know what he'll say?" "What?" I don't know. I don't know what he'll say. I just know that I can't go to him. Not now. Maybe not ever." "It sounds crazy to me," he said, disgusted, and he did, indeed, that very day ride out to Timbuktu all by himself, only to return in the evening clearly disappointed and not a little confused. Ruth asked him what Lyman had told him. I said nothing, and neither did Watson, who I think had guessed by then that there was something dark and personal between me and Lyman, something that could not yet be named by either of us, for neither Lyman nor I knew what it was ourselves. "I never even saw him," Salmon said. "I tried talking to some others, Mr. Gray and the other Mr. Epps, the choir master, but they said there was no Underground Railroad in Timbuktu, like I was some kind of slave catcher or something. Didn't know what I was talking about. Lyman, they told me, was gone off." "They say where?" Watson asked. "Nope, just gone off." "Did you go to his cabin?" Watson wanted to know. "Yeah, and it looked like he'd been doing some work on it. Has himself a pretty decent kitchen garden underway, too. I even saw Susan," he said, and I put down my knife and spoon and looked up. It had been just over a month since they had left, that long since I had seen her, and suddenly, upon hearing her name, I realized that during those 30-odd days and nights I had thought of almost no one else. Her face, her voice, her shape and movement had constantly been in my mind. No matter what I was doing, no matter whom I was talking to, it was Susan I was thinking of, missing, pining for, longing to speak to, and to touch. Lyman, whenever I thought of him, as indeed I frequently did, came to my mind only as an obstacle to my reaching his wife. That I had not once, until this moment, stepped back from my thoughts and observed their peculiar nature shocked and alarmed me. But that's how powerful they were, how all-consuming. This was the source of the pain between me and Lyman, and he had known it long before I did. He had seen that I was in love with his wife, and naturally, as soon as he could, he had withdrawn her from me. My blood washed over me. I felt absurd and then guilty, and wished only that I could somehow purge myself of my love for Susan and make amends to Lyman. Abruptly I stood up and left the house. I went behind the barn and walked up to the grove of young birches there and cut off a switch and stripped it of its new red buds. Back inside the barn, in the darkness, I barred the door and stood in the middle of the large room. I pulled off my shirt and drew the top of my union suit to my waist. exposing my naked upper body to the chill dark. Then I began to beat my chest and back with the switch, slowly and lightly at first, and then faster and with greater force, and soon I was doing it with a genuine fervor, but it was not enough. The switch was too light and broke off in my hand. For a moment I stood half naked and foolish, out of breath, angry at myself. I remembered Father's strip of cowhide hung on a nail by the door. It was short, not quite a yard long, but heavy and stiff and dry with disuse, with a sharp edge to it. I reached out in the dark and took it down. The strip of old leather felt in my hand like a weapon. I struck myself with it many times, perhaps 100 strokes, perhaps more. The pain was very great. I thrashed around in the darkness, slamming myself against the walls and stalls, knocking over stools and sending buckets flying, thrashing like a man caught by a seizure, until at last I was faint from the pain and exhausted and fell to my knees. But the scourging did not work. Nothing would work to purge my thoughts of Susan or alleviate my guilt for having betrayed Lyman. Not prayer, certainly. I prayed so constantly and loudly in the days following that Ruth and the boys teased me and said that I was practicing for Father's return, and Mary told them to leave me be. I was only doing what was right in the eyes of the Lord. I went generally silent on all matters, not just religion, which was how people were used to me anyway. I thought that I might cleanse myself with work, but that too was to no effect, for I was too distracted and anxious to complete any single task without rushing off to begin another, and all I accomplished was to create an even greater disarray and disorder on the place than had existed before. I rushed about, a madman farmer, and my brothers and sisters and stepmother watched me with fear and bewilderment. There was no way to tell them of the source of such turbulence. I was too ashamed, for I was no longer sure that my strong feelings for Susan were generated by love for her, so much as by a morbid, cruel desire to take away from Lyman his greatest treasure. I did not love her. I hated him. What perversity was this? "Come home, Father," I began to say to myself as I raced up hill and down. "Come home and control me, old man. Bring me back to myself. Tell me what it is I must do, and I will do it." Then, suddenly, one morning, there was the old man appearing in our midst like the missing main character in a play, taking over the stage and putting everyone else at once into a supporting role. He appraised the situation in a second, and before he was even off his horse, the man was barking out orders, schedules, and plans, establishing sequences, goals, standards, setting everyone at once diligently to work for the common good. In the evening, after supper, Father bade me give him my views regarding Lyman's decision to live away from us. "I want to know how it goes between you, Owen, and Mr. Epps, and with all the Negroes, too, not just him. I perceive a point of strain, a serious weakness in our relations with them, and I believe that you are the fault," he said. "Give me simply your views on why they've separated from us and why the Underground Railroad no longer runs through this valley. The two are obviously connected." Everyone in the family looked at me, except Father. "Yes, probably they are connected," I said. "No other whites in the settlement are willing to carry fugitives north. They are as cowardly as ever, more so since the Fugitive Act, and the Negroes themselves dare not try it either, except for Lyman. But Lyman has no wagon, not even a single horse or mule, so there it is. No one goes north any more. unless on foot, and that apparently has discouraged the conductors from sending fugitives on to North Elba. Well, that's been taken care of, Father said. I've today written to Mr. Douglas. Service will resume shortly, but you still haven't told me your view of Mr. Epps' departure from us. What did he tell you himself? He would say nothing on the subject. Nothing? No, nothing, Owen. Then I can say nothing either. He studied my face for a long moment. I remember the sound of grandfather's clock ticking. Then he said, "Very well, Owen. It shall remain between you and Mr. Epps. Let us pray, children." In August, like most of the farm families of the region, we took ourselves, our best produce and manufactured items, and our finest livestock down to Essex County Fair in Westport. People came to it from all over the Adirondacks. This was the largest gathering of North Country people that any of us had ever seen. We registered our livestock and installed them in the barns and pitched our camp alongside several other families from North Elba. Father headed straight for the sheep barn. Mary and the girls, Annie and Sarah, disappeared in the direction of the exhibition halls, and the boys, Watson, Salmon, and Oliver, raced away with a gang of young fellows from North Elba, leaving me to wander the fairgrounds alone. Suddenly, there she was. She was a considerable distance away, but glinting brightly in the crowd, like gold in gravel. Outside one of the exhibition halls, the only Negro in a group of white women and girls that included Mary, Annie, and Sarah. Susan's pale gray bonnet hid her face from view, but I knew instantly from her posture and the precise tilt of her head and the easy gestures of her hands that it was she, and my heart leapt up. She and Mary talked together for a few minutes longer, and then Mary embraced her and strolled inside the hall, leaving her to stand alone outside with a characteristically bemused expression on her face. For a moment she seemed unsure of which direction to go, but finally she turned to her left and made her way towards the fairway. I followed at a discreet distance until she turned into a narrow shaded space between the second and third exhibition halls. No one else was there, and I quickened my pace and came up behind her and said her name. She turned abruptly, her dark eyes open wide, frightened to see a man suddenly this close to her. Then she recognized me, and the fear left her face, replaced at once by a heaviness, a sadness as I saw it, which produced in me a corresponding sadness and made me wish to embrace her. In a trembling voice, I said that I was happy to see her. We made light, nervous conversation for a few moments, asking after each other's health, speaking of the weather, the surprising size of the fairgrounds, the great number of people, and so on, until I suddenly heard myself blurt, "Susan, I must tell you, Susan, that in his heart my father has replaced me. He's replaced me with Lyman." "What? Why, what do you mean?" "I bear Lyman no resentment for this, but it's hurt me, Susan." She appeared shocked and said that it could not be true. "You shouldn't be envious of Lyman. He loves and admires your father over all other men," she said. "But you're your father's son, Mr. Brown, and your father, he loves you for that, I know, more than he can ever love Lyman." "No, you don't understand. You see, Lyman is more important to him than I am, and with good reason." She sighed heavily. "What are you wanting me to say to you, Mr. Brown?" please just tell me why you moved away from us." For the first time, she shifted her eyes away from mine. "Well, I explained it to your mother and your sister back then when we first decided. It was due to Lyman wanting to farm his own land and to live in his own house, that's all. We've been with you for a long time." "No, not Lyman. I know why he left, and I know the real reason, too. I'm the cause of that. No, I want you to tell me why you left us." "It's very simple, Mr. Brown. I went where my husband said. That's the whole of it. And you're not the cause of anything Lyman done, Mr. Brown," she declared. Then she lifted herself to her full height and said, "This is not a right conversation for us to be having." "Yes, it is, because we need to talk. I need you to hear me, even though you'll despise me, because it's a sin for me to feel for you as I do, and I have no right to say anything about it to you because—" She placed her hand gently on my arm and stopped me. "Mr. Brown, please, sir, I know you are a decent man, but you're all mixed up," she declared, looking straight at me. "I'm saying this to you, Mr. Brown, because I like you. I truly do, and I know you don't mean no harm. But Lyman, he told me what happened last winter between you and him when you beat on him out there in the barn that day. So I know things, Mr. Brown, maybe more even than Lyman knows, since he is a man and is a little mixed up about these same things, too. But I've watched you, Mr. Brown, and felt sorry for you, because I can see that you're all confused and angered, maybe due to your father, who is a good man, doing good works, and he believes that he needs your help, so he won't send you off from him. Mainly that, I think. That and us being coloreds and you wanting to help our people. It's the two things. They make you think about Lyman too much, which is how you come now to be thinking about me too much." "No," I said, "it's not that. None of it." "Well, just stop that now. Stop. I'm not angry with you, Mr. Brown, because I know you don't mean any harm, but I'm a colored woman and my husband is a colored man, and we wouldn't be having this conversation, not a word of it, if my husband and I was white people." I stepped back from her. "Yes, you're right. Please, then, please tell me what I should do." "Do? Not for me to say, Mr. Brown," she said tenderly. "I know you want to be natural and peaceful and respectful with colored folks, but if you can't, well, maybe you should stick to your own kind. Lots of good folks, white and colored alike, that's what they do. Go away from your father and live amongst white people. Why not go out there to Ohio, Mr. Brown, where your other brothers are, find yourself a wife, and settle down with her?" "A white woman? Well, yes." For a long time I said nothing. Then I whispered, "I can't do that." She smiled at me, but as if from a great height. "Well, Mr. Brown, then I don't know what you can do," she said, and abruptly she turned her back and walked away. "You ain't half the man your father is." The words came without warning, and they chilled my blood. They do even now, more than a half-century later. They were true then, they are true now. First time I heard them, they were uttered by Lyman. But after that, from then on, they were said to me in my own voice, the sentence dripping into my ear like a slow poison. Most men secretly know that there lies hidden inside them the boy they once were and believe they still are, and all the work a man does in his life is accompanied by various stratagems designed to keep that child hidden from view, from his own view especially. But that night in late summer at Indian Pass, when Lyman sneered and declared that I was not half the man my father was, he made it impossible for me ever after to hide my true self from my false self. The Underground Railroad station at Timbuktu was the one segment of Father's subterranean passway that he felt he could control, and he intended to make it off-limits at pain of death for slave catchers, man-stealers, and bounty hunters, so that once he had made this small segment of the railroad secure, he would begin extending the passway southward into the Appalachians, into the forests of eastern Pennsylvania until he came to western Maryland, where he would commence his invasion of the enemy's homeland. By this means he would bleed the South white, he declared, his fantasy for years, then his dream, and finally his plan, too. Now the three had at last coalesced, and he was beginning in his small way to put all three, fantasy, dream, and plan, into action. Thus, Lyman and I, with axes and crowbars, were sent out to bush the old footpath through Indian Pass and make it into a proper trail. Our intent was to make it possible for a horse or a string of horses by day or night in any season to carry fugitives from slavery through to freedom. That thought drove and organized us, and as we worked, we talked of little else. Lyman and I had not been together like this for a long time, a sad time, which I regarded with considerable regret. But out here, alone in the wilderness, we soon found ourselves speaking our innermost thoughts to one another once again, talking of our childhoods and early days, our hopes for the future, and our beliefs regarding all first things. Despite our differences, Lyman and I regarded ourselves, except for race, as remarkably similar, the way that lovers often do. This is a complicated and painful recognition for a black and a white man to make. On both sides, envy and anger get confusedly mingled with love and trust, and so it was with us, or at least with me. I now knew, for instance, that my thwarted love for Susan was my love for Lyman gone all wrong, fatally corrupted by guilt and envy. I did not want to love her. I did not love her at all, so much as I wanted to neutralize my powerful feelings for Lyman, for they had frightened me. They were unnatural. They were the unavoidable consequence of a manly love finding itself locked inside a white man's racialist guilt, of Abel's sweet brotherly trust betrayed by Cain's murderous envy. We were on that third night out, seated before our fire, speculating on the nature of the earth before the arrival of the plants and animals, whether it had been a warm planet, as some scientists were claiming, or cold and covered with ice, as others thought, or whether the Bible was to be believed in this matter in a literal way, when so many self-professed Christians nowadays, even farther, regarded its description of God's creation of the earth as figurative and allegorical. By the way, Lyman said, we know God created everything, the whole kit and caboodle. Question is, first time around, was it ice or was it fire? Did things heat up to get to where they are now or cool down? With all that business about the darkness and the firmaments between the firmaments, it must have been ice, he declared. I'm holding out for a world of ice that God sets to slowly melting over the years. There's still lots of places around here, even where the old original world ain't got warm yet. So you can still see how it was back in them olden days if you wants to. There were a number of ice caves up here along Indian Pass, and he said, you wants to see one? I said sure, and we each stuck a pitchy pine branch into the fire, and, torches in hand, marched single file into the darkness beyond our camp, moving uphill along a rocky rivulet. Suddenly I felt a breath of cold air in my face, as if a huge, dead thing had exhaled. Lyman disappeared from my sight, and I thought the freezing breath of the dying monster had blown his torch out, for all I saw before me was a clutch of low balsams, and behind them the perpendicular face of the rock wall. "Lyman! Where are you?" I cried. His voice came back all hollowed out. He was inside the cave. "Cup your torch and come forward," he said. In a second I found myself standing beside Lyman inside a high, rock-walled chamber in the very mouth of the monster. Looking down its length in the flickering light and leaping shadows, I could see the throat and belly. It was as if we had been swallowed up whole by Jonah's whale. The chamber was freezing cold, and the air damp and still, and our warm breath blew pale clouds. No human could have stayed here long. It was too cold, too dark, too cruel a habitation to visit, except briefly and only to escape blizzard, flood, or fire. Then the ice cave was suddenly like a tomb to me, a stone sepulchre, and we were locked inside it, as if a rock slide had sealed off the entry. I imagined this, but also for a moment I believed it, that we too were actually trapped inside this cold, rock-walled chamber together, and no one knew. We had been at last cut loose from everything in the world outside that had long separated us one from the other, the color of our skin, our war against slavery, Susan, Father, even God. It was a vision that promised the end of solitude. I glimpsed the possibility of escape from my terrible isolation. The loneliness that had cursed me since childhood and that had surrounded me like a caul seemed to stretch and extend itself like a pregnant woman's belly to include another human being inside who was a man like me, who was my twin, myself doubled and beloved, and who was at this instant looking back at me with love. I shoved the unlit end of the torch into a notch between two rocks so that it continued to burn. Then I drew out my knife and opened it and placed it into Lyman's right hand and laid my right hand on his shoulder. He looked at the knife and at me. "Why are you giving me this?" "I have a confession to make." "No," he said in a low voice. "You don't." "Yes, I do, and I'm ready to die for it, but only at your hand." He snorted derisively almost. "I don't want no confession from you, Owen Brown. Whatever you done, you already done it anyhow." "No, not yet. My confession will be the act." "Yes, you has. Ain't nothing you confessed to me I don't already know. Susan told me how you spoke to her, and I seen you sneaking round our cabin nights, and now you wants me to forgive you for it, or else to kill you." He laughed. "No, I ain't gonna give you that. Not either one. You wants to kill yourself, now that's different. Why not, anyhow, sneaking round after a colored woman, a married black woman, like she's not as good as a white woman and deserving the same respect, or like I'm not as good as a white man, when here you is, the son of John Brown." He curled his lip and stared me in the face. "You ain't half the man your father is." He handed the open knife back to me, turned, and left the cave, while I dropped down a well of darkness, his words echoing in my ears. For the 2 days that followed, we worked in near silence, speaking to one another politely, but only when necessary. Hard labor it was, made harder by the silent distance that stretched between us, and at night we dropped quickly into sleep. On the morning of the 3rd day following our visit to the ice cave, we came out of the long forested gorge onto the northern shore of Lake Colden. By midday, we were nearly past the lake and were about to re-enter the deep forest. It had become our habit to stop at noon to rest and eat, and Lyman leaned his axe and crowbar against a birch tree and headed towards a narrow, flat rock that extended a ways into the lake. I put my tools and pack down and followed, not for companionship any more, but because his pack held our small stock of food. We were in a low, wet place and could see but the tip of the rock. I cut to his right, following what appeared to be an easier path to the rock, and when I came out of the thicket, Lyman was on my left and a few feet behind me. He was still struggling to get through the willows, but when I turned and extended my hand to help him, he had ceased moving altogether. On his sweating face was sheer terror, as if he had seen Satan or God. I turned slowly around, moving just my head, and saw what terrified him, and it terrified me as well. A long, tawny gray mountain lion backed up to the edge of the rock, with nothing but the glittering lake behind it and dark water on both sides, and we 2 puny humans in front. The lion had been surprised by our sudden upwind approach, and now it had no doubt believed itself trapped by the water and by us. The animal was no more than 10 feet from me, its great tail switching like a snake. Its shoulders were hunched low and its hindquarters lower, coiled to spring. I had no weapon other than the pocket knife I had pathetically proffered to Lyman back in the ice cave. But I knew that Lyman had his pistol in his rucksack. I showed him my open hand, and with extreme delicacy and without taking his eyes off the beast, he drew the pistol out and extended it to me. Moving slowly and keeping my eyes fixed on the huge cat's yellow eyes, I took the butt of the gun into my right hand, squared my body, and laid the barrel across my left forearm. I aimed at the lion's pale brow, at the top of the inverted V, midpoint between his eyes. I thought I could smell the lion. As I drew back the hammer with my thumb, inhaling deeply, without warning, at the last possible second, the lion sprang from the rock. It crossed through the air some 8 or 10 feet to our left and towards the shore, its forepaws reaching the gravelly bank with ease, its hind paws barely touching the water, and was gone into the brush. Slowly I exhaled, and at once began to tremble. I was truly glad and relieved that it had escaped. The animal was too beautiful to wish dead. Still trembling, I stepped up onto the rock and sat down on the spot of bright sunshine where the lion had been taking its solitary leisure a few moments before, and handed the pistol up to Lyman. "That was the biggest lion I ever seen," he said in a low, amazed voice. I merely nodded. He was holding the pistol at his side, and I looked at it and suddenly realized that I had neglected to let the hammer down. The pistol was still cocked, hair-triggered. If he mishandled it, the pistol would fire. I stared up into his narrow, dark, closed face. He was thinking not of the gun in his hand, but of the lion. The beast's sudden long leap from the rock across water to land had been extraordinarily beautiful, and at once familiar and strange, like the best last line of a beloved hymn. a graceful arc from bright, certain death to the dark, impenetrable mystery of the forest. Why could I not make that same leap? I heard the explosion of the gun and was not startled by it. I looked up at Lyman. For a split second he understood everything. Then his astonished yet utterly comprehending gaze turned blank and flat as stone, and a huge red blossom erupted in the center of his chest. His mouth filled with blood and spilled it, and he pitched forward head first. His forehead, when it hit the rock, made an evil crack like the snap of a dry stick. He rolled over once onto his back, and the upper half of his body slipped off the rock into the lake. Half in the lake and bathed in the spreading swirls of his own blood, Lyman could have been a white man or a black. There was no way to tell which. Blood is red. But I was the man who had never been able to forget that Lyman was black. Until this moment I had never truly loved him. He was a dead man now. Finally, a man of no race. And as surely as if I had pulled the trigger myself, I was the man, the white man, who, because of Lyman's color and mine, had killed him. It was as if there had been no other way for me to love him. There was nothing for love now but all-out war against the slavers. My nature was fully formed, and it was a killer's, and only by cleaving strictly to Father's path would I be kept from killing men who did not deserve to die. Father would be my North Star. Lyman Epps would be my memory of slavery. When Lyman was slain by the accidental firing of his own pistol, reported by me and believed at once by all, I did not know that 4 months later his grieving widow would give birth to his son. I deprived Lyman of that too. The story of how his father died when his mother finally conveyed it to him surely must have cut the boy's heart, leaving him scared and wary all the years of his life. The true story of Lyman's death, my confession, Lyman's son never heard, and has not heard now and never will, unless when he himself dies he comes over to our old farmhouse and family burying ground and finds me still talking into the darkness, the mad ghost of Owen Brown, he who was the murderer of Lyman Epps, he who was the secret villain of the massacre of Potawatomi, the meticulous arranger of the martyrdom of John Brown. But does my beloved murdered friend Lyman speak on into the night as I do here? Impossible. Unlike me, Lyman died with a clean conscience. Thus he surely went instantly silent. That was the year of the terrible Ohio drought, when the hay burned in the fields and the soil crumbled into dust, and so many farmers, especially the younger ones, were pulling up stakes and heading for the western territories to start over again. It was the year that Lyman Epps and I finished our elaborate dance, and I went howling into the wilderness, leaving wreckage and smoldering ruin all around behind me. And it was the year that I followed Father's orders and went out to Ohio to put my brother Fred under my control and bring him back to North Elba, although in the end I disobeyed and took him with me to Kansas, following my brothers John and Jason into the battle there, and eventually, by my actions, forcing Father to do the same. At first in Kansas was the waiting for the old man to bring us the breech-loading Sharps rifles and horses and winter gear for waging war against the border ruffians, waiting for Father to raise funds and supplies and decide to come out to Kansas after all. We were always waiting for Father in those days, quarrelsome, disgruntled, in confusion and disarray, incompetent, undisciplined, often physically ill, filled with dread at the thought of the old man's arrival, and yet at the same time nearly giddy with impatience for him to come and darken the portal with his familiar shape, and lower his head and walk into the tent at the pathetic encampment we called Brown's Station. And it happened just as I imagined it would, just as I hoped and dreaded it would. The tent flap was drawn suddenly away, and against a milk-white sky loomed the dark, familiar shape of Father in his broad-brimmed black hat and his great coat. Things changed quickly then. Father set everyone to work at once. In half a day, Father had turned Brown's Station from a place of desolation into a proper frontier settlement. There was down on the Pottawatomie River a particularly nettlesome settlement of border ruffians, the Shermans, the Doyles, and the Wilkinsons. They were landless farmers who drifted up from the southern hill country, angry, poor, ignorant people who took their greatest pleasure in making drunken threats of violence against northern abolitionists and against us Browns especially. There were not many Negro slaves in the region, 100 perhaps, rarely more than 1 or 2 attached to a single owner, as most of these pro-slavers, like our Pottawatomie neighbors, were failed, landless farmers, many of them without families even, and with almost no livestock. In fact, the motives of the pro-slavers for coming out to Kansas were no less mixed than those of us free soilers. Like us, they had come for land, for pecuniary advancement, and to wage war over slavery, usually in that order. And to be truthful, their wild, violent, racialist, and pro-slavery rhetoric was no more incendiary than ours. The difference between the two sides was that, whereas their rhetoric was Satan's, ours was the Lord's. The death of Lyman Epps had made me permanently a different man. It froze me at the center of my heart, gathering ice in layers around it, so that in a short time I had become outwardly a hard man, a grim, silent warrior in my father's army, soon to be a killer, more feared by the slavers for his cold, avenging spirit than any free soil man in all of Kansas. More feared even than Father, Captain John Brown himself. Counting Father, we were now a band of 6, brothers Fred, Salmon, and Oliver, our brother-in-law Henry Thompson, and me. Here and there, at different times, we were joined by some of the more radical old-time settlers and by the newcomers to Kansas, who had heard of Captain Brown and wanted to fight slavery alongside him, those who could comply with Father's ban on whiskey drinking, swearing, and tobacco, who were willing to honor the Sabbath, and most importantly, men who were able to subject their wills entirely to his, for he brooked no correction or argument, and he consulted no one except me, who had the old man's ear now and knew when to whisper into it and urge him on to action, who knew when and how to suggest retreat, who knew exactly the way to buck him up when his spirits flagged, and how to calm him back to reason when his temper made him intolerant and his frustration with the cowardice and caution of others turned him into a sputtering dervish.